So, I mentioned briefly in my last video that I'm finally in my dinosaur hyperfixation phase, which of course means I'm going to make this everyone's problem. And by problem, I mean looking too deeply into animated paleomedia and posting that analysis online simply because I can. Which I really should have expected this to happen eventually, given one of my favorite movies growing up was... Dinosaur was a Disney movie that came out in the year 2000 to an overall positive reception. At the time, the animation techniques that were used were groundbreaking and incredibly impressive. It combined live-action shot footage with animation, making for a unique cinematic experience. And that reflected in the box office as well, as it opened at number 1, making $38,854,851 in its first weekend, and was even Disney's third best opening at the time that it was released. It helped contribute to the boom in 3D animation that came in the 2000s, alongside movies like DreamWorks' Shrek, which came a year later. And with a soundtrack crafted by James Newton Howard and Lebong Merake, what was not to love? Needless to say, it was a very successful movie that many credit for the popularity of the Carnotaurus, an apex predator that was commonly overlooked in favor of the infamous and much larger T-Rex. And rightfully so, because the framing of this dinosaur is fucking terrifying, especially in the Dinosaur DVD game. I remember my sister and I being afraid to choose a direction, and we would hide once we did and stay hidden to make sure we weren't going to be jump scared. Whoever thought baby's first horror game would have been on the DVD player, of all places. Anyways, this video isn't about reliving childhood trauma. Nope. Instead, I wanted to take a look at all of the dinosaurs featured in the movie and list off a few facts about them as well as the movie's production. Now keep in mind, I'm obviously not a paleontologist, so feel free to correct me in the comments if any of the research I've done is incorrect or outdated. I'll include my sources and the like in the description if you wanted to double check or if you wanted to do your own research. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of the animals that will be talked about aren't actually dinosaurs, 2 examples being that of insects or mammals. Anyways, I guess really what I'm trying to say is we're talking about every living thing that's seen in the movie, excluding the plants. Some of these I've identified myself, and others have been directly identified by those who have worked on the movie or by dinosaur fans online. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing we want to do is pinpoint when and where exactly this movie takes place. Since Dinosaur is essentially a tale of alternative history, it's actually relatively easy to deduce that this takes place in the late Cretaceous period. We know this because the dinosaurs went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, during the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, also known as the KT extinction. Within the first 20 minutes of the movie, the Chicxulub impactor is seen hitting Earth, setting off the events that comprise the rest of the movie. This also means that Aladar was initially located near the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, since we can clearly see the impact taking place relatively close up, putting the movie's location in prehistoric North America. So that means that the main criteria for the animals we're looking for is that they should have existed within the late Cretaceous period and lived in what is now North America. Now, that won't be the case for all of them, as you'll very soon see, but it does narrow down our search when we're presented with multiple potential options for identification. So let's start off with our main protagonist, Aladar. Aladar, along with Nera, Crone, and Bruton, are iguanodons, an iguanodontid that existed in the late Jurassic to early Cretaceous. The taxonomy is complicated and something I'm honestly not going to claim to fully understand, but it is said to have lived in Europe, North Africa, North America, Australia, and Asia. There are some deposits that have also been found dating to the late Cretaceous in Europe and South Africa, making this dinosaur fit the criteria that we mentioned earlier. In 1825, Iguanodon became the second species to be described scientifically as a dinosaur, the first having been Megalosaurus. Iguanodon was 30 feet long, stood nearly 6.5 feet tall at the hip, and weighed 4 to 5 tons. According to David Krentz, a Canadian-American paleo artist who worked on Dinosaur, it was initially frustrating to design the iguanodon as the main character, because they were told to ignore features that the fossil evidence pointed toward in order to make a more animation-friendly design. Iguanodontids were closely related to hadrosaurs, also known as the duck-billed dinosaurs, and, much like hadrosaurs, iguanodons also possessed a beak rather than fleshy lips. However, because the main character was an iguanodon, it was important that he was able to both move his mouth to talk and properly convey his emotions to the audience. They're characters. There's walking the line, and then there's going over the line. We had to walk the line. In order to make them read as characters, we really had to push things, and that meant making them very inaccurate dinosaurs. However, that didn't stop some of their unique design traits from being inspired from fossil evidence. For example, Krentz did extensive research on iguanodon skeletons before determining that it wouldn't have been too far-fetched to have them emote with eyebrow-like structures. This was because of a little bone found above the iguanodon's eye socket, which was theorized by one research paper he came across to have been able to move. Whether or not that hypothesis is accurate, it still led to the creative process and helped to soothe Krentz's conscience of their design inaccuracies and implementation of artistic liberty. It also helped that because a lot of the herd dinosaurs did not have speaking roles, it was possible to make them accurate based on our understanding at the time, like, for example, the Parasaurolophus. Parasaurolophus is perhaps one of the most famous hadrosaurs, iconic for its crescent-shaped crest. It lived in North America during the late Cretaceous period, and like the iguanodon was thought to have been a herd animal. Parasaurolophus is estimated to have been 33 feet long, 16 feet tall, and weighed about 3.5 tons in adulthood. The first time we see a Parasaurolophus in the movie is when a baby is curiously investigating Aladar's egg, only to be promptly shooed away by his mother. We also see adult paras later in the movie mixed in with Crone's herd. Surprisingly, fossil records suggest that mixed herding during migration was likely. We can also look at modern animals to get an idea of how prehistoric animals probably behaved, especially when in relation to migration behaviors. In the case of herbivores traveling in mixed herds, we can look to zebra and wildebeest migrating together to the central part of the Serengeti in April and May. In their case, mixed herding makes sense as they have similar migration methods and are going to the same location. And in the movie, since they were all migrating to the same nesting grounds, it's likely just that it was a convenient coincidence. Large numbers means better protection from predators, who only tend to go for the lone, young, sick, or elderly members of the herd. This was not unique to modern predators, and was also likely the case for carnivorous dinosaurs. Risk versus reward, or the reward system, is something that has lasted across the ages, and just because we can't observe it happening in real time with the dinosaurs doesn't mean that it wasn't occurring before we existed. Though as far as the iguanodon leading the entirety of a mixed herd species, well, that's a good old artistic liberty that we mentioned earlier. It was used to make these dinosaurs characters rather than just, straight up dinosaurs. It would have been far less compelling narratively if Krone was only leading the iguanodons mercilessly, because then he wouldn't have been responsible for Ema, Earl, and Baleen. Without these three characters, not only would there be far less conflict, but there also would have been a severe lack of dino diversity. The last thing that this movie needed was more iguanodons. In fact, I'm honestly kinda tired of talking about them. So why don't we move on to something more visually interesting, like, let's say, a sauropod? Now, Baleen is an interesting case because in the art book she's listed as a brachiosaur, type of sauropod that existed within the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous period. Fossilized remains of Brachiosaurus have been found in North America and Europe. Brachiosaurus grew to over 80 feet long, 42 feet tall, and weighed more than 28 tons. However, identifying Baleen isn't that simple. Dinosaur fans have speculated that she's closer in appearance to a sauropod called Giraffatitan, which has a very complicated history as far as classification and identification goes. Giraffatitan is a genus of sauropod that lived during the late Jurassic period in what is now Tanzania. It was originally classified as an African species of Brachiosaurus, but has since been moved to its own genus. Though interestingly, most popular media depictions seem to be based on Giraffatitan instead of Brachiosaurus, creating a case of mistaken identity. For a long time, Giraffatitan had the only fossil skull available for what was thought to be a brachiosaur at the time, which is why many depictions are different from actual fossil records. An actual brachiosaurus skull just wasn't available or identified yet, and so paleontologists simply worked with what they thought was accurate at the time. This will be a common theme throughout the video. The skull of Brachiosaurus wasn't known until 1975, though it had actually been unearthed in 1883. The skull that was discovered in 1883 was theorized in 1975 to have been classified incorrectly as a Brontosaurus skull, which led to several years of extensive research. In 1998, the skull was conclusively found to belong to Brachiosaurus based on similarities to other brachiosaur skulls. Considering the movie was in production before 1998, it would have likely been impractical to change the design to make it more paleo-accurate, especially since the technology being used to make this movie was so new. Though for the late 1990s and early 2000s, calling her a brachiosaur as a broad way of classification would have been accurate, as in 1914, it was classified as a species of Brachiosaurus, and was only moved to its own genus in 2009, which, of course, happened after the movie had already been released for a full decade. So it's hard to fault them for that. For the sake of intent, we'll just go with Brachiosaurus for identification, especially since Brachiosaurus lived in North America and Giraffatitan didn't. While Brachiosaurus was already extinct before the late Cretaceous, this was another case of artistic liberty. Sauropods were the largest animals to ever walk the earth, and so having that wow factor that these long-necked dinosaurs still bring to any movie environment is important. Baleen was by far the most complicated dinosaur to identify on this list though, so I promise not all the others are going to get this convoluted. In fact, Baleen's companion Ema is far more straightforward to talk about. Ema was a ceratopsid called a Styracosaurus. Styracosaurus existed in the late Cretaceous period and lived in North America. This herbivore could get up to an estimated 18 feet long, 5.9 feet tall, and had a total weight of around 3 tons. They were thought to have been herd animals, though not to the same extent as other herbivores or even other ceratopsids. This is evidenced in fossil records as they can be found in herds but were more often found on their own. This implies that Styracosaurus was perhaps more solitary than other similar dinosaurs, such as Centrosaurus, which lived 1 million years earlier. This trend of becoming more solitary as time progressed seems to have continued, as the infamous Triceratops, which was the last known of the ceratopsians, appears to have been even more of a loner. A theory as to why traveling alone seemed to be more frequent was due to its massive size. Triceratops were not small animals, and would have needed a substantial amount of plant matter to fuel their bodies. Triceratops was 26 to 29.5 feet in length, 9.5 to 9.8 feet in height, and 6.1 to 12 tons in weight. This was significantly larger than Styracosaurus, and even bigger than the previously mentioned Centrosaurus, which was 16 to 18 feet long and roughly 2.8 tons. Triceratops' adult size meant that it needed substantially more resources, which meant there was more competition between those of its own species. More competition meant smaller groups of herds would need to form, leading to a more solitary but not completely isolated lifestyle. This was only further evidenced when a fossil bed was found containing 3 juvenile Triceratops that were presumably traveling together. We can look at modern-day animals here as well to substantiate these claims. African savanna elephants, which are today's largest land animal, travel in herds of 8 to 100 individuals, whereas plain zebras, who are much smaller, congregate in herds of up to 1,000 individuals. The herd size is dictated by the amount the land can sustain, and so prehistoric Earth must have followed these limitations as well. Because Centrosaurus was the smallest of the 3, it makes sense that it traveled in larger herds. Speaking of Centrosaurus, it also had a brief cameo in the movie, though not in the way you would expect. Anyways, moving on to the final main dinosaur character. Earl was a Euoplocephalus, an herbivorous ankylosaurid that lived during the late Cretaceous in North America. Euoplocephalus was about 17 feet long and weighed about 2.2 tons. Like most ankylosaurids, its most defining characteristics was its short flat armored torso and clubbed tail. Earl was labeled as an ankylosaurus in the book, but it was later revealed by the crew that he was modeled and based on Euoplocephalus specifically. This distinction is important as another ankylosaur, Talarurus, also made a brief appearance in the movie. Talarurus was a genus of ankylosaurid dinosaur that lived in Asia during the late Cretaceous period. It's estimated that it could grow up to 16 to 20 feet long and weighed nearly a ton. Talarurus is Asia's, specifically Mongolia's, most well-known ankylosaurid, which is especially important since as of 2018, ankylosaurids are now thought to have originated in Asia between 125 million and 100 million years ago. Ankylosaurids, stegosaurids, and sauropods in general have had a pretty nasty reputations of humans assuming they had low intelligence due to their laughably small cranial cavities, even when in comparison to other dinosaurs. There was even a theory that they might have had a second brain in their butt to compensate for this, evidenced by the enlargement of the spinal cord and the area around the limbs. Though dinosaur brain expert Emily Bacholtz explains that based on living animals with similar anatomy that have been observed in the present, this only implies that there was increased nervous system tissue, not a sacral brain. Useful for predicting dinosaur movement and behavior, but not so much for finding out whether or not they possessed more assets. This is probably why in the movie, Earl is portrayed as a pet rather than as an equal to Ema, Baleen, and Aladar. The art book also describes Earl as being akin to a loyal dog to other dinosaurs like Ema and Baleen. Though some paleontologists argue that a small brain didn't necessarily mean lack of intelligence, and that dinosaur media may potentially be giving these animals a bad reputation. Since they're extinct, it's really difficult to definitively say whether or not dinosaurs with small brains were in fact as dumb as we assume they were. On the other end of the spectrum, however, we have arguably the smartest animal shown in the movie, and it isn't even a dinosaur. Now, this was the most tricky to identify specifically because mammals didn't get their turn in the limelight until well after the meteor hit. That's not to say that they didn't exist, but they were rarely above-ground dwelling animals, for obvious reasons, really. In the art book, it's mentioned that Plio and her family of lemur-like animals were only created because the team was worried that the dinosaurs weren't cute enough to draw in an audience. They had scales instead of fur, so it was assumed that marketing would be difficult without that cute factor that could be translated into a huggable, marketable plushie. So despite knowing mammals most definitely would not have interacted with dinosaurs to the extent that was shown in the movie, it was deemed as a necessary evil of sorts. Because of this, the lemur species shown in the movie is one that's completely fictional and made up for the sake of marketing. Actual lemurs were studied in order to aid in their creation, since at the time lemur movement wasn't well documented. However, that's not to say that it didn't have real prehistoric inspirations like the rest of the cast did. In fact, it's even speculated that it would have been possible for early primates such as lemurs, monkeys, and apes to have emerged by the late Cretaceous and lived alongside large dinosaurs for a very, very brief period of time. So despite the commitment to inaccuracy for the greater sake of the movie, it turns out that it may have not been so far-fetched to include these furry beasts after all. As far as what extinct animal most likely inspired this furball family, I had initially come up with a few options, but ultimately decided on Notharctus as our culprit. Notharctus was an early primate that existed in the late to middle Eocene in the Cenozoic era and lived in North America and Europe. The body form of Notharctus is similar to that of modern rats, and its fingers were elongated for clamping onto branches, and included the development of a thumb. The animal was about 16 inches in length, excluding the long tail that weighed 2 to 4 pounds. Because of their body structure, they would have been well suited for life in the canopy of dense forests. Notharctus and its close relatives became extinct by the end of the Eocene epoch, while other more modern lemurs survived in tropical forests, particularly on the island of Madagascar. There have been no fossils of lemurs found from the Pliocene, which is likely why they resorted to using Notharctus as inspiration. Despite it not having existed during the same time period, they were close enough in time to draw that inspiration from. It's also a nice Easter egg that Plio's name is Plio, because it seems to be derived from the word Pliocene. Very clever. And believe it or not, Notharctus is not the only 9 dinosaur that we saw in the movie. There was also Koolasuchus, which we saw relatively early on. Koolasuchus is an extinct temnospondyl from the Cretaceous period that lived in Australia. It was about 14.5 to 15 feet long and weighed roughly 1,100 pounds. It's also the youngest known temnospondyl, which is considered to be a primitive type of amphibian. Despite its somewhat goofy-looking appearance, it was probably a formidable predator in its time period. It likely would have fed on fish, crustaceans, small animals, and scavenged from carcasses. Koolasuchus probably had a lifestyle similar to that of a crocodile, which makes its name more ironic as it translates to Kool's crocodile, though obviously this early amphibian is more similar to that of a salamander than it is to a crocodile. So while it wouldn't have been found in North America and therefore not had a chance to try eating Aladar's egg, it very much was a large aquatic predator that existed within that time period, and a pretty cool one at that. Heading back to the dinosaurs though, let's talk about a very well-known one. Velociraptor. Velociraptor was a small dromaeosaurid that lived in Asia during the late Cretaceous period. Unlike popular media depictions such as the Jurassic Park franchise would suggest, this dinosaur is only 4.9 to 6.8 feet long, approximately 1.6 feet high at the hips, and weighed about 31 to 43 pounds. It likely would have preyed on small lizards, mammals, and even baby dinosaurs and eggs. It was a feathered dinosaur and wouldn't have looked as scaly as it does in most popular media depictions. However, this inaccuracy was another victim of the times, as the team doubted their ability to make feathered dinosaurs look scary. They also lacked the technology to put feathers on the models, which was another major contributing factor. So it wasn't for a lack of trying or of knowledge, but because it was deemed necessary for the completion of the movie to remain scale. On the bright side, they made their sizes relatively accurate when compared to the Iguanodon, a bold move to make when Jurassic Park had already made their own iconic portrayal of the extinct animal just a few years earlier. And of course, we all know which one ended up gaining more fame. When most people hear Velociraptor, they're probably picturing this instead of this. Velociraptor wasn't the only dinosaur in this movie from Asia either. In fact, there was another small dinosaur, though this one was an herbivore instead of a carnivore. Meet Microceratus, a small ceratopsid that lived during the Cretaceous period in Asia. Microceratus, meaning small-horned, walked on two legs, had short front arms, a frill, and a beak-like mouth, and was around 2 feet long and only weighed an estimated 6.5 to 22 pounds. This dinosaur was originally named Microceratops, but 15 years later, scientists realized that name had already been taken by a species of beetle. So, in 2008, the name was changed to Microceratus. As mentioned previously, it lived in Asia, similar to that of the Velociraptor. They both have fossils that have been found in Mongolia, which in terms of movie canon would suggest that they somehow found their way over to North America together after the asteroid hit. As cute and tiny as Microceratus is, though, we still have a much larger ceratopsid that we haven't yet covered. Pachyrhinosaurus is an extinct genus of centrosaurine ceratopsid dinosaur from the late Cretaceous period that lived in North America. Pachyrhinosaurus was one of the largest ceratopsids and grew up to 27 feet in length and weighed almost 4 tons. While large, the most interesting thing about this dinosaur was its skull. It had a thick, bony nasal boss where many ceratopsids had horns instead. It's thought that similar to pachycephalosaurids, it could use this feature to inflict blunt force trauma on competitors or any would-be predators. Which, with it being as large as a pickup truck, being hit by it would certainly cause a lot of damage and make even the largest of carnivores think twice about risking a broken bone in exchange for a meal. Its uniqueness definitely sets it apart from Styracosaurus Centrosaurus, of which it was closely related to. Another dinosaur with a similar attack strategy that also appeared in the movie was none other than Stygimoloch. Pachycephalosaurus spinifer, also known as Stygimoloch, was a pachycephalosaur that lived in North America during the late Cretaceous period. It was 7 to 10 feet long and weighed roughly 170 pounds. Even though it was a smaller dinosaur, its headbutts were probably not something to be taken lightly. Like Pachyrhinosaurus, it was built for dealing blunt force trauma to predators and headbutting to compete with rivals. It was basically a prehistoric mountain goat, with the really thick and bony head instead of horns. We know that this is likely how their heads were used, since 22% of all pachycephalosaurodomes examined had lesions suggesting osteomyelitis, which is an infection of bone resulting from trauma. This would suggest that they did indeed headbutt things, either in order to spar or to defend themselves. However, the most interesting thing about this dinosaur isn't its method of defense, but rather a more recent discovery regarding it. A lot of scientists now think that Stygimoloch, along with Dracorex, are actually a younger form of Pachycephalosaurus rather than a separate species. They determined this by cutting open the skulls and looking at the ports of each to determine the age of death, finding that the Stygimoloch and Dracorex specimens were young, while the Pachycephalosaurus skulls were from animals that were older when they died. This showcases how our knowledge and understanding of dinosaurs is still evolving to this day. Things that may have been accurate in paleomedia back then may not be in the modern day. Another such dinosaur that's appearance has changed over the years is Struthiomimus. Struthiomimus was a suspected omnivorous ornithomimid dinosaur. It lived in the Cretaceous period and inhabited North America. Before the idea that dinosaurs were feathered was popularized, it was common to portray these bipeds as smooth-skinned, featherless ostrich-like animals, which was quite ironic as its name literally translates to ostrich mimic. The theory that Struthiomimus specifically may have been feathered came from fossil discovery in 2009, where a fossil in Ornithomimus was discovered. This fossil contained what scientists called evidence of fossil fuzz and feathers, implying that the orientation was similar to that of modern ostriches and emus. It was only in 2012 that this discovery was announced, which has led to the depiction of this dinosaur to change. Struthiomimus was a relatively small dinosaur, being estimated at 14 feet long, 5 feet tall at the hips, and a weight of around 330 pounds. But what it lacked in size, it more than made up for with its speed. Because of its long legs, it's estimated that this dinosaur was able to reach speeds of up to 31 to 50 miles per hour. If this estimation is correct, this would potentially make it the world's fastest dinosaur that we know of. And due to its close resemblance of the ostrich, it's entirely plausible that it was indeed that speedy. Ostriches have been recorded running up to 43 miles per hour, clocking them at a speed only slightly below its prehistoric cousin. Usually when people talk about their favorite dinosaurs, I hardly ever hear the bird-mimic dinosaurs being talked about, and I think that's a little upsetting considering they probably would have behaved something like this. Next up, we have Ichthyornis, which doesn't look too dissimilar from what we see in today's animals, and that's because it was, more or less, an ancient seabird. Ichthyornis was a toothy seaboard-like ornithurian from the late Cretaceous period of North America that closely resembles modern-day gulls and terns. The average individual was the size of a pigeon, being 9.4 inches long, with a skeletal wingspan of 17 inches. Unlike modern birds, however, Ichthyornis possessed teeth, which were thought to have been used to hold its prey, manipulate objects, and preen its feathers. When the dinosaurs went extinct, so too did the toothed birds. However, it isn't the only flying animal that was depicted in this movie. Geosternbergia, aka Pteranodon sternbergi, was a pteranodonted that lived in the late Cretaceous period about 88 to 80 million years ago. It was first found in Kansas in the 1950s by George F. Sternberg, from which it got its name. This flying reptile was one of the largest known pteranodons, with a wingspan of over 24 feet long and a skull that measured over 3 feet in length. It had a distinct lack of teeth and is theorized to have been a piscivore. It's worth noting, however, that like with Giraffatitan, many paleontologists still regard Geosternbergia as a second species of pteranodon rather than a unique genus. It's even thought that Geosternbergia lived before Pteranodon and may be its direct ancestor. A neat fact about pteranodons as well that I like to throw out there whenever I can is they aren't actually scientifically classified as dinosaurs. The funniest way that I've seen them referred to is dinosaur adjacent, since both dinosaurs and pteranodons belong to the group Argosauria. One such separating factor in classification between dinosaur and pteranodon are their hip and arm bones. All dinosaurs have a hole in their hip socket and a crest on the upper arm bone. All pterosaurs do not. There are flying dinosaurs, but they're just known as birds. This is just one of those fun to file to the back of my mind to bring out at awkward family gatherings facts. Speaking of awkward family gatherings, I don't know how to make the transition into the next animal on this list, so Longisquama is a genus of extinct reptile. There is only one known species, Longisquama insignis, known from a poorly preserved skeleton and several incomplete fossil impressions that date from the Middle to Late Triassic. Longisquama belonged to Central Asia rather than North America. This is probably one of the most inaccurate animal inclusions in this movie, since both the time period and location are not in accordance with fossil records. Longisquama was by all accounts a weird little guy, but it was not a weird little guy who was capable of flying. In fact, there's still debate on whether or not it was even capable of gliding. This isn't at all a knock on the movie itself, though, as ideas of what this small reptile was capable of has been a mystery for decades. Scientists originally thought it was a tree-dwelling animal with weird back appendages, and then they thought it was a tiny flying relative of the birds, and then they went back to their previous assumption. Some things will just remain a mystery, as unfortunately we have no way of observing these animals in real time. The thing we do know for certain, though, is that it lent to one of the most iconic movie openings of the 2000s. At first glance, Cordulagomphus is a boring inclusion. This insect is an extinct genus of dragonflies that lived during the late Cretaceous in Brazil. While not belonging to North America, it isn't that far-fetched to assume that other dragonfly species existed all over the globe during the Cretaceous. After all, dragonflies are an invertebrate, and invertebrates are the most successful and prolific animals on the planet. If nothing else, I think it would be more surprising if they were exclusive to South America. While this does seem boring, and maybe to you it is, I think it's rather fascinating that dragonflies are still around and relatively unchanged today. It's crazy to me to think that I can interact with a dragonfly in my backyard and know I'm looking at an animal that has existed since before the dinosaurs did. Maybe that's only mildly existential to me, but the idea of the sound of its wings scaring a juvenile dinosaur makes me smile a bit, because some things on our planet never change. But as fun as prehistoric insects are, we're going to end this video on a dinosaur, and one that has a bit of a bad reputation in paleo media, actually. Oviraptor is a genus of oviraptorid dinosaur that lived in Asia and North America during the late Cretaceous period. Its name literally translates to egg thief, which probably isn't something you even need to be told considering that its introduction and only contribution to Disney's Dinosaur is fighting over Aladar's egg in a comedic fashion. Paleontologists would later discover that naming it egg thief was a misnomer, but the damage to its reputation had already been done. When the remains of Oviraptor were first discovered, they were perched atop what appeared to be a clutch of Protoceratops eggs. This is what gave it its name, as it appeared to be fossilized with its claw caught in the metaphorical cookie jar, so to speak. However, decades later, paleontologists unearthed another feather theropod closely related to Oviraptor, sitting atop what were indisputably its own eggs. Because of this new evidence, it's likely that our initial understanding of this dinosaur was severely misunderstood, and that the initial fossils simply contained a parent Oviraptor and its unhatched eggs, not Protoceratops eggs. Like modern-day chickens, Oviraptor likely brooded its eggs and then temporarily looked after and raised their hatchlings. Since birds are distant descendants of feathered dinosaurs like Oviraptor, this is the much more likely scenario surrounding what was happening in the fossil first discovered by Roy Chapman Andrews. The shape of Oviraptor's mouth even hints to it having fed primarily off of mollusks and crustaceans, which it cracked open with its blunt, toothless beak. That's not to say that they were not opportunistic as most animals are, but they were no more of an egg thief than any other non-specialist dinosaur was. As it stands, eggs are a good source of protein that even herbivores of the time may have snacked on for themselves if the opportunity was presented. Regardless, applying morality to a dinosaur because of its diet, or any animal for that matter, is a very anthropocentric way of looking at things. And that brings us to a total of 19 different animals that appear in Disney's Dinosaur. Glad that's finally over, because now I can go back to playing Path of Titans. Just kidding, of course I saved the absolute best for last. This is Carnotaurus, a carnivorous theropod that lived in South America during the late Cretaceous period. Smaller than its movie portrayal, Carnotaurus measured up to 30 feet long, 10 feet tall, and weighed up to 2 tons. Its name translates to meat-eating bull on account of its horns and carnivorous diet. While its small, seemingly useless arms may make it somewhat goofy looking upon first glance, this prehistoric predator was not one to be viewed as a joke. It's estimated to have been the fastest of the large theropods, with scientists' most recent calculations estimating that it had a top speed of 30 to 35 miles per hour. For a scary comparison, the fastest a human being has ever run is 27.5 miles per hour, which was a speed only briefly achieved by sprinter Usain Bolt. The average human, however, would be easily outran clocking in at only 8 miles per hour. Instead of fearing T-Rex, which was thought to be a slow-moving, ambush-reliant predator, Carnotaurus would have likely been much more of an existential threat to humans if they were alive today. And the Carnotaurus in Disney's Dinosaur was even more terrifying, standing around 15 feet tall and measuring a seeming 40+ feet in length, closer to the size of Tyrannosaurus Rex than what its real-life counterpart was. And there's actually a reason for this. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Dinosaur's original antagonist was going to be the T-Rex. The 3D model was made with this dinosaur in mind, but it was changed to Carnotaurus well into production. The reason given was that Disney thought Carnotaurus looked more evil than T-Rex on account of its devilish horns. This is also why a lot of the Carnotaurus model looks different from more paleo-accurate depictions, as a lot of its anatomy was inspired by T-Rex. Regardless, this is the first major paleo media appearance that this dinosaur had, that I personally know of, and is considered to be the main guiding force in its current popularity. The purpose of Carnotaurus's horns is unknown, but there are several theories ranging from it being combat related to helping them socially in either finding a mate or identifying others of their species. The purpose of their comically tiny arms is also unknown, but it's theorized that because Carnotaurus had a ball-like head at the top of its upper arm, they had a wide range of motion. While many think it's simply a vestigial feature left over from their ancestors, some paleontologists, such as Darren Naish, think that coupled with the muscular shoulder girdle, their anatomy was far too specialized for that to be the case. Disney would eventually course correct on the scientific inaccuracy of their antagonist by claiming that the Carnotaurus seen in the movie was a fictional Floridian subspecies rather than a real dinosaur found in Argentina. They aptly named this subspecies Carnotaurus robustus floridiensis. In the soon-to-be-defunct Dinoland USA and Disney's Animal Kingdom, there was even a skeleton of the Floridian Carnotaurus displayed in the lobby of the dinosaur ride. The skeletal replica is a casting made by combining elements of cast material from a Tyrannosaurus rex and scaled-up casts of actual Carnotaurus sastre material. Regardless of Carnotaurus' presence in the movie being inaccurate, plenty of other dinosaurs that we've mentioned throughout this list also fit the criteria of not being native to the movie's setting. While it isn't explained how Carnotaurus specifically migrated through 2 coastal seas to get to what would now be prehistoric North America and eventually evolved into a whole different subspecies, the other instances are much more easily theorized through a fictional lens. Like in the instance of Microceratus from Mongolia, who in the context of the movie most likely traveled where the dwindling vegetation led them once the asteroid hit. This eventually had them crossing the North Atlantic or Arctic Ocean in a desperate final attempt to escape starvation. Velociraptor, also from Mongolia, may have hunted Microceratus to stay alive as they eventually had nothing left to scavenge from, following their only remaining potential food source to North America. In the movie, Ema even states that she's seen dinosaurs that she's never seen before, and considering she's an elderly Styracosaurus that this movie makes a point to tell us has made this migrations dozens of times before, it's safe to assume that she's never seen these particular species before because they aren't from that continent. While of course this situation seems far-fetched, it's important to remember, as I mentioned earlier, that this movie is both fictional and a case of alternative history. It's thought that a majority of dinosaurs died within hours of Earth being hit by the asteroid. All megafauna likely perished within 6 to 12 hours of impact, whereas it may have been possible that some smaller dinosaurs survived for longer and clung to life for a limited amount of time until their eventual extinction. Of course, we know that an estimated 25% of life did end up surviving the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, most notably the mammals. That may be why at the very end of the movie, Zinni finds a bunch of unrelated Notharctus that also managed to find the last remaining lush area of Earth. It ends on a positive note, possibly serving as a nod to the eventual rise of the mammals. Of course, the movie also shows a variety of herbivorous dinosaur hatchlings in the end, but that's where the alternative history thing comes in. I think it would be far too depressing to be like, oh yeah, all the dinosaurs died and Zinni and his family are the only ones left. Regardless, this whole thing also sort of hits on the point that applying human morality to an animal based on its diet is pointless. The only reason we see the Carnotaurus as antagonists in this instance is because they aren't the main characters. Alidar and the other herbivores are. Realistically, both they and the Velociraptors in this movie are simply fighting off the slow and inevitable loom of extinction. An animal is an animal, and they have to eat to survive. It's not their fault that their diet consists of meat. That isn't to say that they were any less terrifying, because they absolutely would be harrowing animals to cross paths with. Even the fuzzy mammalian variety of predator we have on our planet today is scary, if you're aware of what they're capable of and evolved to do. This brings us to an actual and final grand total of 20 different animals that were seen in Disney's Dinosaur. I hope that this video was at the very least interesting, if not educational. Any dinosaur fans or experts, please feel free to correct me in the comments if I got anything wrong. I know it's a lot of information. As mentioned in the start of this video, I am including a list of all of my resources if you want to do some reading for yourself, so please look at the description for those of you who are interested. Also, feel free to comment below what your favorite dinosaur is and why. I personally am a fan of sauropods just in general. I don't really have a specific one that I like more than the others. Though if I absolutely had to choose, it would probably be the Apatosaurus. What can I say? I grew up watching The Land Before Time. And if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, including further topics of animated paleo media, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell to be notified of when I upload. Special thank you to my patrons: Ambrose Rothwood, Jeffy Games, Brandon Noons, The Lovely Ghosty, Sadin Suzuki, Charlotte Allen, Lee Taylor, Zachary Ansley, and Hariana Hook. Because of people like them, I can continue to make content like this. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Have an amazing day, guys!